James McAuley. I should say I'm a journalist here in Paris with the Washington Post, and it is my great pleasure to be here with you today to moderate our discussion this hour titled Memoirs, Museums, and the Memory of 9/11. And we will be talking about museums, the issue of collective memory, and how we come to terms in public with a very traumatic past, which I'm sure you have explored in lots of other angles throughout the conference. It is, before we get started, let me introduce our esteemed guests on the panel with me. First, we have Henri Rousso, who is right over there, who is the president of the soon-to-be Musée-mémorial here in Paris about the terror attacks here in France, and we can talk more about that in a little bit. We have Cliff Chanin from Cliff's official. I can't read my notes here. Sorry about that. He's the executive vice president and deputy director for museum programs at the 9/11 Museum in New York. And finally, to my left is Anna Slafer, the Vice President of Exhibition and Programs at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. So thank you all so much for joining me this afternoon, and I look forward to what I am sure will be a very enriching conversation. So this is an enormous topic, and there are so many ways into it and so many important themes to consider. But I think we might just start sort of with a very general question, which is quite simply, how we think about commemorating 9/11 in general. So you have looked at 9/11 and its various representations in a lot of different ways, and its aftermath, especially we are at this sort of very important anniversary year. And I think one question to get us started would be, what is the real project here, and what should the project ought to be? Should we focus on commemorating the event itself, i.e. the atrocity, the traumatic day, everything that happened then, or on its aftermath and its legacy and its effects? And I mean, also there's the question of the war on terror, which kind of spun out of that day, all of which are hugely important, but that are slightly different emphasis nevertheless. So I think I'd like to start there, and maybe Cliff, if you have some thoughts to get us started.
Sure. Well, I also want to thank the organizers for inviting me here. Yeah. It's 20 years, and all of the various ways of looking at 9/11 are not mutually exclusive. And in fact, the memory of 9/11 has changed quite dramatically over these 20 years and will continue to change. And so I think where the emphasis lies depends on what's happening in the world. I mean, we had 9/11 solidarity, we had 9/11 fatigue, we had 9/11 resentment, and those have overlapped at various times. And so, our museum, as sort of a pivot point for so much of this, has maintained its core mission, which is the commemoration of the event and the telling of the story in the surround of the event, and expanding the way we talk about the consequences of 9/11. And so 20 years later, that is changing. I think we all sort of came to this anniversary, and a number I learned just before the 20th anniversary was that 75 million Americans have been born since 9/11. And so that may explain to some degree the extraordinary interest, global interest in fact, in how the 20th anniversary was being commemorated. And our education programs actually got 3 times the attention. We had 1 million students tuning in to this webinar that we run every year on the anniversary. It was just extraordinary. That was 3 times the number that we'd had before, and 300,000 is not a small number. And so my sense is the interest is going to grow as it changes, and it is the role of any museum to sort of set its course, but also adjust its course as time changes.
Would either of you like to add, comment? Okay.
Yeah, a small one.
Sure, yeah, please, by all means.
Okay, well, thanks to the organizers who...
Yes, I should say that as well. Thank you so much to the organizers. I forgot that in my notes, but you guys have done a wonderful job.
Now, it's a small statement. Actually, it's your question is quite interesting because if you take commemoration of world wars, World War I, World War II, for example, usually we commemorate the end of the war as a major event. August, kind of 8th of May 1945 or whatever. Regarding 9/11, we probably commemorating the eve, the beginning of something. So it's a huge difference. And then probably commemorating the event itself means to commemorate its aftermath, which we don't know exactly what it is right now. I mean, if I take the example of my own project, we have to take into account the history of terrorism for backwards 50 years, but we will have to take into account the future attacks, so the future developments of terrorism or reaction or the effect of terrorism. So thinking about 9/11 or commemorating 9/11 is commemorating an ongoing process, something which is not finished.
So I would add at obviously both are needed, memorial, memory, and learning about what it means, and as we don't know what it's going to continue to mean. But so at the Spy Museum, we're not a memorial, we're a museum that educates the public about the process of intelligence, why it exists, how it works, so that people can make informed decisions in this oversight process of intelligence, and they can become more informed when they read the media about intelligence. So our goal is more academic in many ways, but we had two different ways we've addressed the topic. The museum first opened in 2002, and it was almost done right after 9/11. It was already pretty much set. So the first thing we did in 2004 was open a temporary exhibition called The Enemy Within, The History of Terror in America from 1776 to Today. And our goal there was people couldn't remember they obviously remembered 9/11, but not even that many people remember the Oklahoma City bombing, which happened in 1995. So we felt our goal was to get people to understand that this has been going on since the country was established. The terrorism has been going on. So we wanted to educate people about that. And we also wanted to educate people that the development of counterintelligence had evolved as a reaction to all these events. And that it's always, though the overall that's been successful, it's always been a balance between civil liberties and security. That's always been the difficulty. So we did this exhibit starting back with 1776 and picking 9 periods of history and bringing it up to 9/11, which we couldn't say much about because everything was changing, at that point. So that was actually the smallest part. And then in the new museum, which opened in 2019, we take even a different approach because we're looking at the process of intelligence, and we sort of we look at how 9/11 is part of analysis. We look at it as part of gathering information. So we always take a case study approach. So it's sort of a different. We learned, from the beginning of the museum, and now we've done something different.
That's super interesting. I mean, hearing all of you speak just then, I mean, I think the question of collective memory in general is fascinating, largely because, with all of your different, narrative choices and your exhibitions, et cetera, collective memory is not necessarily a given. It's not a granted, right? I mean, it's up to, there's this line from Susan Sontag that I love, which is that strictly speaking, there is no such thing as collective memory. What is called collective memory is a stipulating. So it's something that's actively constructed in a given moment in time by either institutions like yours or, historians in their respective books or artists or filmmakers, what have you. And I was wondering about that. So, when we talk about the collective memory of 9/11, I think we all have a vague sense about what that means and about what it ought to mean. But From your vantage point as the leaders of these institutions, or among other leaders of these institutions, I mean, what role should an institution like a museum or a memorial have in stipulating the memory of an event like 9/11? Because obviously there are so many directions the memories could take. So what is the sort of obligation of an institution in coming up with an answer to a question like that?
You should take that.
Well, I mean, I guess I would quarrel with the idea that memory is stipulated in that way. It's much more fluid than that, and it changes in ways that are not controllable. When you actually come down to it, you have a building, you have people coming to see something, and you have to figure out what story you're telling and how you're going to tell it. I mean, there are many other things that come out of that, but that's the point of departure for any of this. And so, in our case, what was really interesting, we started building the museum. The memorial goes back to first planning efforts for the memorial emerged in 2002, and the museum planning effort began in 2006. And there really weren't any historians of 9/11 at that point, which is, distinct from, making a World War II museum at, a certain point afterwards, as they have in New Orleans. You have a great body of historical expertise to build from. Obviously, there are precursors to 9/11, and there are fields of knowledge that are relevant to telling the 9/11 story, but the actual event itself was not set in history in any way that we could turn to a group of historians who knew this better than we did. And so whatever our version of 9/11 was going to be impactful in terms of how it was seen. Now, there were many people outside of our activities who had all kinds of views of what 9/11 meant, and some were critical of the way we went about it, and others were off in a different realm. In fact, the idea that memory is stipulated, I think, is contradicted by the experience of how people resist official versions of memory in countries around the world. And there is a common perception, however that is developed and however that emerges. I mean, taking an example of Turkey. So with the creation of the Turkish Republic, they were very clear. They actually had they still have an official history-making institution. That is to tell the story officially of what Turkish history was and how the Republic came to be and what happened with the various populations there. Well, there were various civil society organizations. In a previous life, I worked with one called the Turkish History Foundation, which was trying to come up with a much more currently acceptable account of what had happened in Turkish history. So this idea of resistance, the Pamyat movement in Russia, I mean, again and again and again, the idea that this can be set by one authority in one place is disproven by the fact that it comes up from the ground if there is not a public debate about these things. So, our version clearly is one that has a home, that has a place that people can come to for it. But there are many ways that the history of 9/11, as this conference has demonstrated, has emerged as a source of discussion or debate.
Well, and I'm also interested because you are the site, you are a memorial site, and I know that those first few years were just filled with public, the families. I do not envy you your position. That was very challenging. So that must have had a very big role in how you shaped what you were doing.
So this was, I've been involved in the effort here in Paris, and Henry can tell a funny story if he wants, because it's not of the moment, but the idea that the memorial function and the education history function are separable is one that our experience in New York does not bear out. And it goes starting at a human level in the sense that, how do you tell the story? So you tell the story in many ways, but a key to our story is the story of people who were there or people who lost loved ones who were there. And that storytelling is facilitated by the fact that by 9/11, when it happens, there is technology available that allows us to be inside the story to some degree. The comparison I always make is with Oklahoma City, which is just a few years before, but that technology did not exist, so you weren't inside the story in the same way. So having that access to the intimacy of the story, the intimacy of the death of victims, which is now a much more advanced technological possibility in relation to the recent stories in France or the story that they tell in Norway of their terrorist attack of 10 years ago, you are then part of an intimacy that was not necessarily the responsibility of the History Museum before.
Yeah.
And so relationships develop out of that. Your sense of what kind of story you're going to tell evolves out of that. Now, there is always a balance to be set. And again, people can choose or imagine a different balance than the one we set. But some threshold has been crossed in telling these stories. And 9/11, because of that technological moment, I believe is the moment where that was crossed, where the intimacy of death, which is the most intimate moment of a person's life in some way, has been violated. It has been exposed and shown publicly, which means the survivors of that person live not just with the death, but the violation of the intimacy of their death. And so that presents an entirely different range of choices and decisions than would have been the case had 9/11 happened 5, 10, or 20 years before.
That's fascinating. Building off of that, and something that Anna mentioned just a few minutes ago about the difference between a museum and a memorial, I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about that, and specifically vis-a-vis the Paris project. So perhaps, Henri, you might get us started. The Paris project is both, in a sense. It's the Musée-mémorial, right? Absolutely. So these are two distinct things which have different definitions and different purposes. And I wonder how you see the reconciliation of the two of them and how that's meant to sort of work together.
Well, they're not in conflict. We don't need a reconciliation. But Cliff say some words about it. There is no real definition about what is a memorial and what is a museum. I take two examples. The Mémorial de Caen in France is not a memorial. It's simply a huge museum on World War II. And the Mémorial de la Shoah in Paris is both a museum and a memorial. The problem of a memorial, usually you have to build a memorial on a specific site, like the 9/11 Museum and Memorial, which has been built on the crime scene, if I can say that. We have a different perspective, because the main idea of the project is not to build a memorial and a museum on a specific attack, but on a process, and taking into account all the victims in France from all terrorist attacks and abroad, French victims abroad. So one of the first difficulty we have to invent a site. Inventing meaning to find one, we found it, hopefully, and to reshape it, to transform it into a place to remember, to pay a tribute to the victims, and this is a memorial. On the other side, a museum, of course, is a place to learn, is a place to understand a rather complex phenomenon. Terrorism as a complex phenomenon, as a collective experience. The memorial will be dedicated to the victims as individuals, which is very important, meaning we will have, certainly, and we have begun to work on it, all the names of the victims from 1974. I will explain afterwards why 1974. So the memorial is more or less on the side of the individual experience. The museum is both. It's about individual experience, for example, through testimonies. We will have testimonies like in any museum of that kind, but we will try to explain a collective experience. So there is no split between individual, of course, and collective memory. And just one thing about collective memory, because I dedicate most of my work on this issue. I'm rather close to Susan Sontag on one point. The collective memory, to my point of view, is a metaphor. Meaning, on just one thing, you don't have an organ to remember. On the contrary, I mean, as an individual, we have organ to remember. If you have a brain problem, you won't remember. So saying that a society is remembering is a metaphor, but it's a very important metaphor. Mm-hmm. And places like museums are precisely places where we try not just to construct, of course, it's a construction like any social phenomenon, but we try to give an idea of all the representations of, for example, a terrorist attack, and there will be a part on 9/11, of course, in our museum. It's a place to give a place to testimonies. But testimonies, for example, during or after the attacks, testimonies 10 years after, testimonies 40 years after. So in a museum like that, we take into account that memory has a history, which it is obvious to say that today it wasn't a few decades ago. So the museum is a place to retrace the history of memory. You were saying, for example, we have to take in account the event and its aftermath. In our museum, we have in mind, I'm not sure we will succeed to do it, but we have in mind even to represent the memory of the event, to represent how some attacks, for example, has been taken in account, has been represented by the French society, or hasn't. Just one example, if you look for before 2015, before the attacks of January in Paris, the attack in January and November, it was very hard to find a plate or some specific mention of terrorist attack in many places of Paris. After 2015, many of them have been added. So not just the memory, but the policies of memory are changing all the time, and the building of such a museum and memorial will foster a kind of une prise de conscience,
a reckoning.
Yes, and just one thing: the idea of our project is based on one simple, motto. I say it in French: c'est la reconnaissance et la connaissance. Reconnaissance, recognition. Okay, because in French there's a kind of a joke. La connaissance, it's learning, is to have the possibility to understand a phenomenon, to give a meaning to what happened, which is one of the most important things victims are asking to us. We need a meaning. Why? I don't know. I don't have the answer, of course, but we will try to provide some elements to understand, and on the long term, not just on one attack. So, of course, the memorial and the museum will be different things in their spirit, but the idea, and I think now because we have found a very nice place, it will be possible to consider the whole site as a unique site, as a
you can say in French, yeah, by all means, yes.
You understand the idea? I mean, when you will be in the museum, you still will be in the memorial. And this is the experience of the 9/11 Memorial and Museum in New York, who gave me this idea.
That's interesting. I was just going to ask you guys about the connections between your two projects. So maybe, Cliff, if you have anything to add about that, or
okay, come on, you do it. We had sort of a group of our museum and NYU and the CNRS and the Mémorial de Caen were given a grant by the French government a number of years ago for exchanges about these very, very issues. And a group of French scholars came over just after we opened the museum, and I think I met you then. Had I met you before? I can't remember.
No, the first time.
Yeah, and so that began to build the relationship. And of course, when we learned about, so just for reasons that we did not fully understand and that we certainly didn't anticipate, our museum has become a reference point for communities around the world that, faced with some terrible event, begin planning for a memorial of some kind. It may be a museum too, but the point is, how do you publicly remember in a place what had happened? And as I say, we did not anticipate any of this, but because I believe of not just the global focus on 9/11, but again, the global view of the intimacy of what the loss was, which really struck home with people around the world. We had pre-COVID 3 million people a year coming to the museum. 1/3 of those people were from overseas. So this was a global event, as this conference again proves. So people began coming to us to ask how we did it. And again, it's funny, what they were really looking for were shortcuts, and the answer was there are no shortcuts. But that said, there were things we had gone through that were variously relevant to different projects. And so when the project began here in Paris, because I had already had this prior contact, and because I think our museum has become a reference point, whether you like it or not, I became involved, and therefore our discussions have gone back and forth between what we did and what the planning is. And insofar as it's useful to the planning here, I think it's wonderful. And insofar as it's not, every project ultimately finds its own path forward.
Thank you for that. I think just to transition into some of the kind of more specific discussions about debates over what to include in museums or memorials on events as traumatic as these. Anna, I was going to ask you a question about the enhanced interrogation division in your museum, and sort of what that debate was like, and sort of how that fits into the question of commemorating an atrocity such as the one we're talking about.
Well, so
and maybe first, for the our guests who haven't seen it, just to explain what it is a bit.
So as I said, we have the museum is set up. It follows 5 key activities of the intelligence community and spies. So we start with collecting intelligence. That's the most basic thing intelligence agencies do. We start with the human spy, which is the oldest. Then we go with, once you've collected this information, what do you do with it? So the next gallery is making sense of secrets. And then once you have that information, what do intelligence agencies do? They could do nothing, or they could go abroad and try to influence events. So we have a gallery on covert action. And then the other main thing is to protect the homeland. So those are our major galleries. And then we have a gallery on how spying changed history. So we have, again, we are not a chronological, we decided to do a thematic approach so that we could change stories out as time went on. But with the area of which the gallery called An Uncertain World, which is really about counterintelligence and counterterrorism, we have an exhibit on interrogation. And I will be honest with you, it was not something the curatorial team wanted to do. But we have a founder who is now 92, who had funded the original museum and occasionally would take an active role in wanting certain things addressed. So we didn't think it was appropriate at this time to do this, partly because there hasn't been enough time to look at some of these issues, and we are dealing with historians, and we're not a news organization. And this actually, our founder owned many news and television stations. That's how he made his money. And then he had gotten bitten by the spy bug when he was in the Korean War and wanted to do a museum on intelligence. So he wanted this topic. So there was a lot of headbutting between the founder and the curatorial staff about what was going to be in this. And we came to somewhat of a compromise, but it went rather quickly. So it was supposed to be about intelligence, meaning it has to be about interrogation, that's the theme, when we use the enhanced interrogation program as a case study. So what we ended up doing for various reasons is it ended up being much more about, he wanted it to be about torture because he's also a very dramatic guy and he wanted to, catch people's attention. So it had a lot about torture, and then we had the enhanced interrogation case study as part of this not very big exhibit. So they became conflated. So the interesting part of the controversy was this all happened before the museum even opened, and I blame Scott Chanin, the reporter at the New York Times, because he, before the museum opened, he had done an article on the museum, and his big question to us was, are you going to tackle the tough stuff? Is this museum going to be like the old museum, which was fairly superficial, or are you going to really deal with the issues? And that's what he was coming to see. And the article that he wrote in the New York Times, he was very impressed that we had tackled that issue. We had tackled secrecy. We had tackled a number of things. So he wrote a very positive, he was just excited that a museum was doing this. Well, that article came out and then all hell broke loose. So we had the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Dianne Feinstein, and her staff who had written the report on after the fact on the enhanced interrogation program. We had human rights activists. We had the attorneys representing Khalid Sheikh Mohammed come talk to us. Well, let me start by saying that the most interesting thing was no one had seen the exhibit and everybody was complaining. So that happens a lot. So a tweet went out and someone saw the Scott Chanin article, and all of a sudden we were pounded with complaints by people who had not seen the show. So our historian, he was great. He emailed people and he said, if you'd like to come see the show and have comments based on having seen it, then happy to speak with you. So we ended up over the course of a year doing a number of talking sessions with different groups, the International Red Cross. So we invited people in to talk and hear what they had to say, and they were impressed with that. We had a lot of people who took us up on it, and we talked a lot with the Senate committee. They were unhappy. It's funny, everybody has, a stakeholder has their opinion and what they want represented, especially when it's a controversial issue. And especially now, things are more controversial, and people think that, we're a private museum, we're not a federal museum. They want their perspective. So we listened, we made it very clear that we wanted to make changes because we actually weren't happy with the exhibit that we ended up with. So, but we told everybody, you are not going to be happy with what we come up with because it's not going to be everything you want. So we went back and rethought the exhibit, and we added, for instance, in the end we changed very little, but we changed enough. We added a whole section. There was no section on non-coercive techniques, and people were upset about that, and understandably. So we have the torture section, the coercive section, then a whole section on on how do you tell about a lie, how do you do non-coercive techniques. The Senate committee wanted more detail on the process of the whole process of the investigation into enhanced interrogation. At any rate, they're not a museum. They're not museum people. They don't care if people don't want to read every single little thing. So you've got, you're trying to balance that. And then they wanted their report and they were mad because we didn't have the report posted. And we said, we had a rationale. Because we stopped when Obama ended the program, and this was afterward. So we're talking about maybe 300 square feet of space. You can't do everything. We had a water board, and we had people who were complaining because we didn't have the gurney that was used for the, later. Anyway, it was just très compliqué.
Yeah.
All I can say. That's
Sounds
all
like
the French
it.
I know. But anyway, I don't want to go on any longer, except to say, at the end of it all, people are actually happy. But not everyone got what they wanted, but everyone who came back, we invited the people back to see it. Took us a year to redo it, and COVID was in between this, and people were satisfied. So it's actually, we're satisfied, and that was the main thing, that the curatorial team be satisfied. But we have not had any complaints since then. But we have new issues. We have women in intelligence are upset about our Mata Hari exhibit. So it keeps rolling on.
Very interesting debates. I guess a question for both Cliff and Henri, and whoever wants to jump in first, by all means, feel free. I've seen myself the museum in New York, and I was profoundly moved by it, as I'm sure so many of us were who have seen it. But I mean, kind of building on this notion of debates over what to include. I mean, it's perhaps an obvious question, but I'm very interested to hear your answers, and then also about how this is playing out in the current thinking about the Paris Museum Memorial. When you are faced with creating and preserving the memory of an event as horrific as 9/11, or indeed the recent terror attacks in France, which we have all lived through here in this room, how do you decide how much of the actual horror to show in the permanent exhibition? And what place does what role is it meant to play in, as you said, Henri, giving a sense of meaning to the victims and their families? How is that conversation begun, and how do you think about these issues?
Wow, many questions in one. So for the last one, the relationship with the victims, with the associations, victims associations, because in France it's different than the situation in the United States, began very early, actually at the very beginning of the project. And the project actually was launched by a small structure within the Ministry of Justice, which is entitled La Délégation interministérielle à l'aide aux victimes, which is a kind of a small secretary of state dedicated to the question of the victims in general, not just for terrorism. And a small group, mainly one person who was actually now on the mission, Elisabeth Pelcet, who was at that time la déléguée interministérielle. She gave a kind of a outline of a whole policy of memory for the victims of terrorism, including a new commemoration, including, for example, a medal for the victims of terrorism, and including the idea of the memorial and the museum. So the idea was to have a kind of a coherent policy on two sides. The side of reparation, we have to reparate, the state has to reparate something to the victims, and on the other side we have to preserve the memory and to provide the knowledge. So this is one of the major issues, and I want just to react about what you said. Will you deal with the issues? This is a question I've been heard for now 2 years. And the issues we have to face are a lot of. We have a lot of issues because we're not focusing on the recent attacks. One more time, the core of the permanent exhibit will be from the end of the 60s to the present days, even until tomorrow. So why? Because we want to provide a history of contemporary terrorism. And we know, and I know as a historian, that terrorism is not just a contemporary phenomenon. It began a long time ago. We will have a retrospective on the 19th century. We will speak a little bit about the anarchists. We will speak a little bit about the Algerian War, which is the permanent question. Will you evoke the Algerian War? Because the memory of the Algerian War is very vivid, as you know, in France. And then I would like to add something. When you're doing an exhibit or a museum, and you're talking to people about the project, not the actual museum, the project, they expected what they already know. They don't expect something new. They want to see in the museum what they already know. They want to hear about the Algerian War, about the OAS, about the... And the idea is to say, yes, of course we will speak about that, but we will speak also about what you have completely forgotten. See, I just, on this issue, I'd like to give you just a personal example. When I began to work on the question, I made a chronology as a good historian. I need to have a chronology. It's quite difficult. There was about 5,000 attacks in France in the last 50 years. So, and just I realized that there was an attack in my area before 2015, in the 80s, in a market I'm going every weekend. And they were a casualty. I simply forgot completely the event. And one of the one of the purpose of the museum is to say to a large audience, we have been living with terrorism and with the consequences of terrorism, with the effect of terrorism for a long time, and you don't know it. And we will try to explain how and why.
It's an interesting problem because we have the same issue. People are going to expect to hear certain spy stories or certain stories, and you have to do them, and you have to select which ones. But then you want to have them know the interesting stories that they know nothing about. And those are the ones they often walk away most interested in, the ones they hadn't heard of. So.
Very interesting. Yeah, and I imagine with 9/11, there is a lot of like pre-formed images that people have when they come to your museum as well.
Yeah, the planning process for us involved just, minute focus on how far we could depict the event. I mean, again, this is a global event. It's the first global event seen live in real time as it's happening. So you're not just dealing with after reporting, you're dealing with people saw it. They didn't need an interpretation of it. Now, there are things to interpret, of course, and not everybody had the full story at that point. But the impact on people of seeing this was just extraordinary and continues to be for those who actually had the memory. So, the question is, the horror is an integral element of the event as witnessed by people. So the balance becomes, if you don't show elements of the horror, you're actually betraying the knowledge that people have of what they saw, and yet at the same time, showing too much, however you define it, risks re-traumatizing or traumatizing people who are in the museum, but it also risks violating the intimacy of the death of the victims. The best example I can cite for you is you develop a vocabulary for these things. So, as we all know, there were people who were trapped above the impact of the airplanes who had no way out of the building. And there are photos of people standing at the edge of the building, and whatever's going on behind them is fire and smoke, and in front of them is the open sky. Now, one of the things about an extraordinary event like this is it actually cannot be described in normal language. Does that person actually have a choice? It's ridiculous to say that. What's really awful about this is that those people who were trapped in that situation were actually made to be complicit in their own murders, because there was no way out, but for whatever reason, they hadn't actually been killed by the act itself. And so you have people perched literally at the edge of their lives. The other thing about an event like this is the metaphors become actually real. So we talk about the line between life and death as though there is such a thing. Yet, in this case, the line between life and death is the edge of that building. So, all of that is far too complicated to actually take in, but it's a critical memory of people of that day, and it defines the horror of the event. So we had many, many long discussions about all of this, and our decision was that we would show images of this, but in a separate part of the historical narrative, so you wouldn't have to go. We put a warning outside this little alcove where this material was presented. We put quotes on the wall that reflect witnesses to this, what they saw, how they describe their reaction to it. And the other decision we made was we would not show video of people falling, only still photography. And we would not show anybody who could be identified. That was the compromise we came up with. I will say we have not heard much, if anything, by way of criticism of that decision. Maybe that would have been true if we decided a different way, but apparently we landed in a spot that made sense to the vast majority of people who see it. So, for us, so much of the narrative involves these kinds of moments for people and moments of witness. So, okay, step back from the people who were caught in the event as victims. There are also people caught in the event who got out of the building and looking back up are seeing this, and then the building falls and the dust cloud is coming toward them faster than they can run away from it. Well, that's a whole other story, and yet, how do you not tell that story? And the pictures that there was a police helicopter flying above the whole thing, and there was a detective on it who had his camera with him. He took the most extraordinary pictures of the canyons of the streets of Lower Manhattan filling with the smoke, and the smoke literally like this, you know, this gust from hell enveloping along the line of the street, so the side streets are clear. You know, you make choices about things that have never been seen before, and how you make those choices may well influence how future choices are made about the same kind of material, because this material is now part of these kinds of events. So the image of that French, the police officer being shot in the street outside the Charlie Hebdo office, that's going to be a terrible challenge, because you know who the officer is. The video shows the terrorists contemplating what they're going to do with this guy, shooting him, and yet how else do you tell that event than by representing it, because you have the material to represent it.
And your visitors will have already seen it and will have remembered it. Yeah.
If I
Yes, please.
say
Of course.
something,
Yep.
We are in a different situation, not just because we're covering a large sequence of history, but because in France there were trials, and which is one of the difference with the United States. The difference. There were many trials during the last few years, and according to the recent one, if you're following what's going on at the Palais de Justice now, a lot of informations are provided into the court and to the public. The description of what happened in the Bataclan is simply sometimes impossible to hear. But it's public now. And we will have all this material, because one of the originality of our project, it is based on a collection, because we're building a museum, we need collections. And the core of our collections are the pieces of evidence of the trials. We had a deal with the Ministry of Justice and I don't want to go into the details, and the Tribunal de Paris. And we have also we're lucky because in France, since 1986, the first law defining terrorism, all the trials are centralized in Paris. So it's very easy for us to find all the elements. So that this will be the core of what we will show. And when you're talking about pieces of evidence, you're talking about violence. Of course, we have weapons, we have photos, we have films, we have a lot of things. Then the question is it possible to avoid to show a scene of violence? The answer is no. I mean, how is it possible when you deal with terrorism? And I will take just an example. The few museums all over the world dedicated to a terrorist attack, there are very few, actually. 5 to 6. I say 5 to 6 because I don't know the Tribute Museum is still alive in New York, but there is one in Oslo, there is one in Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City is probably the first one of the series. It was inaugurated in 2001.
April 2001.
I mean, a few months before 9/11. And there is also, and there is a new one which opened a few months ago in Vitoria-Gasteiz, which is the capital of the Basque country. Most of them are dedicated to one terrorist attack, like 9/11. The Spanish museum is dedicated to the Basque terrorism. The French one is the only one to take into account all kind of terrorists, political, nationalist, Islamist, whatever. So. And all of them are showing scenes of violence in many different ways. But we can't avoid this issue. And one of the difficulty on another side, when you go today into a museum or you go to an exhibit, a high-tech exhibition, you have this concept of immersion, l'immersion. You plunge into the scene, even into some picture, paintings, whatever. We can't do that. We can't. But people now, I mean, the new audience of museums are expecting this kind of new things, new technology. Will you use new technology? Yes, we will. But how? We don't know. We have a kind of a conflict between technology and ethics, which is, the usual one, but especially in this kind of situation. And hopefully, there are the trials. If you follow the recent, the last week, for example, when the policemen described what they saw at the Bataclan or in the terrace, it's simply unbearable. And we know all these documents. We have some. And we will probably, je le dis en français, on va les mettre en scène, if it's forbidden to say that. But we will try to use them in a kind of, I have a kind of a concept, it's not a concept, it's a notion of distant experience. We have to plunge the visitor into a kind of an experience. A museum is a bodily experience. It's not just intellectual. It's not a book on a wall. You have to talk to the senses, to the eyes, to the smell, to the touch. So at the same time, you have to create immediately a distance, like in a trial.
I'm just curious if the Holocaust museums that have come before, did you turn to any of those when you were thinking about 9/11?
No.
That's an excellent question.
My view is that why are we doing these things, right? It is, in my mind, a post-Holocaust phenomenon that this idea of public collective memory about these kinds of mass violent incidents are a public good. They're taught in schools. There's this International Commission for teaching the Holocaust. That is a departure point in history. And however Holocaust memory changes or is represented differently in different places, nonetheless, the event remains central. We certainly reached out. She came in as the director of the museum. Now she's president and CEO, Alice Greenwald. She came from the Holocaust Museum. That's not to say the experiences are always that close, because the Holocaust museums are made retrospectively with different kinds of materials. And my encounters with different Holocaust museums in different countries is there is a sort of national interpretation that comes through in those events. But yes, as a kind of place that has to make decisions about how you represent. And they're still discovering pictures out of the Nazi archives of the mass violence. So they had to make really difficult decisions about how to show things, and we had many conversations with folks involved in that kind of decision making too.
I think we have time for just one more question before we take questions from the audience. And if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you all about the question of future generations and how they react to, or not how they react, but how the notion that 9/11, the recent terror attacks. I know that there are other attacks that you're considering in the narrative you're presenting, but the recent ones will certainly be on people's minds, and everything in your museum as well. These are somewhat contemporary issues that people are aware of, that people have even lived. But Cliff, you mentioned at the beginning that something like 75 million Americans have been born since 9/11. That is also part of the public that you're going to be reaching out to, and increasingly as we get further and further away from the event itself. And I wonder how you balance the two things when you do contemporary history, which is something quite unique in these discussions, or being true to the event itself, which is in living memory, like very much so, and the fact that there is a sort of growing visitor base that will not have any experience of it, and what they are owed, if anything special at all.
Well, we have one of the great experts on contemporary history, so
yes,
you go first.
Well, Well, one part of the question is about the youngest generation. So actually, 3 days ago, we had our first meeting as an institution, and this meeting was organized by the team, by our team, and it's with the presentation of the first project of the museum, because we want to let this place existing before the opening. The opening will be, I don't know, 2027, if I'm optimistic. So, but we try to make this site alive before. And the project is a very simple one. We took about the 14 classes of collège and lycée, young people, 12 and 13, and we helped them to organize an exhibit on the topic. So they're doing the exhibition. We're not explaining them what is terrorism, what you should do, what you should think about it. We just say, here is the project in a very general way. And they decided, with their teachers, to work on, for example, the trial, the ongoing trial on November 15, on the question of art, and on the question, j'ai oublié le troisième. Anyway, so, and this is one of the ideas, to co-construct, I can say that in English, and then to co-construct an exhibition with the students. And one of the elements is why, of course, November 13 is our 9/11. It's a very recent one. It's a traumatizing event. It's a mass murder in the core of Paris in peacetime. But also, it's different from 9/11. These attacks were targeting young people. Obviously, I mean, not obviously. I mean, if you hear to the perpetrators now in the trial, they're saying that. So most of these young people they are concerned, they are completely aware about what were these kind of attacks, and they are living in the middle of terrorism. We have, I mean, this generation is born with terrorism, and it's completely aware about that. So, and what happened that I was fascinating as the responsible of this project, because these young people immediately se sont appropriés. They took the project for themselves, and they began to create something. This is one of the way we were doing as a museum. I don't know if I answered the question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's absolutely the question.
Well, it's interesting because we have a terrorism section in our counterterrorism section, and in part of what we wanted to do with our initial exhibit on that traveled was we didn't want to leave people depressed when you walk out the door. So that's part of showing that this has been going on a long time, and that people are resilient, and things can, people survive and things go on, and we wanted to address that a bit. So in our current exhibit, we don't have a lot devoted to it, but it's terror where we live, where we work, and where we play. We have 3 case studies, and we start with the 1920s in the United States, and we talk about government oversteps. We make a big point to talk about when the government took too much action, when they deported radicals in the 1920s, the anarchists, the communists, the Jews. They sent them as part of the Red Arc. It was one of the first Red Scares. And we have footage of seeing police dragging women out of their homes. This was Emma Goldman's time and all this. So we talk about oversteps because we want people to understand that the government can obviously do too much. It's not just. And then we have work, and then that's our case study. There is Oklahoma City, and then play. We have the 1972 Munich Olympics. But for each of those, because we want people to know it's the contemporary. We have Bataclan. We always add and have things from all over the world that have happened more recently. So we try to give the past to the present and different kinds of environments and show the international side of things.
Yeah, I mean, for us, 20 years is actually the marker of time since the event that we focus on, and then so much that's happened since. I think actually it's an extraordinary opportunity because trying to explain some of the subsequent history of 9/11 to an audience that is too young to have remembered it, so you're simply trying to explain something to them, it's very, very different than explaining it to an audience that has very strong opinions about these very events. You know, we've been criticized for not wading into some of these political disputes that unfortunately are very apparent in our country. But you know, one of the things that's remarkable about our museum has been that it has felt accepting to everybody who comes there, regardless of what they think about everything else. And you know, you think about explaining something to a kid who doesn't have any memory of it. It's very different than you would explain something to someone, the same thing to someone who has a deep investment in their opinion about that thing. And so, you know, I think that's going to be a way in which you know, we will have a responsibility to explain these things, whatever they are, to the younger generation. They're as entitled to know about what happened after 9/11 as they are to know about 9/11 itself. And so I think we're well equipped institutionally because we've given so much focus to our education programs over the years to begin to take on these very difficult questions, but presenting them to people who don't actually know about them or who have an opinion about them. And I think that's going to be a really interesting challenge for us, but I think it is, you know, I feel a very strong pull to sort of figure out how to do that.
Well, and part of it is finding the universal and timeless aspects that go across all these things, and getting people to think about those issues. When we did our first exhibit, we asked a question at the end of each case study that was relevant but timeless. So, for instance, should the United States ban hate groups? You know, it's sort of we weren't drawing a direct connection to 9/11, but we were trying to raise should they ban groups that disagree with the government, trying to get people to make their own connections to these issues without beating them over the head about most recent thing.
You know, it's funny, you know, we've been criticized, others have been criticized too, for not asking the right questions. But what that actually turns out to mean is not asking the right questions. It's providing the answers that the person who's asking for them really wants. You know, so you don't want questions. You want whoever it is, in our case, our museum, to be aligned with what you think, which is very, very different. And it's a very, very different set of problems than, okay, what are the real questions here and how do you get at them?
Well, that was all absolutely fascinating from start to finish, but I think we have time for just a few questions from the audience now. So how did this, do we have a, okay, great, we've got a microphone. So, all right, we can start in the back with the gentleman on the right.
Hello, thank you very much for this panel. The French philosopher Simone Weil wrote that history is written by the winners. And I wonder if these museums are not a way to show our wounded nations as winners, because this museum allowed us to write this history, although we are still vulnerable. Sorry for my broken English.
Whoever would like to...
Well, I was just going to say, we have this whole issue with the museum, in that even with our stakeholders, some of whom are obviously former intelligence officers who, for instance, are offended when we take our historians say one person's terrorist, or one person's spy or whatever, a traitor is another country's hero. This is a big issue in terms of espionage, because the gray world, there's no black and white. And so we've had people complain to us that we have put a spy, a Russian who spied for the United States, in our area on traitors, and they're very upset about this. We've gotten a lot of complaints because these are people who've worked with this guy. They, you know, it's from the 1970s, and so they say, well, the Soviet Union is a separate. It was so bad we can't even count them in the same category. And we're saying we're trying to get people to think about the issue. If you don't put them in the issue, you know, together. So it's who's writing the history, but trying to get people to think about what the questions are, as opposed to telling them what to think. And that's what we're trying to do.
You know, I actually think the recent developments in museums contradict the statement about victors writing history. I mean, look, the Holocaust museums in Germany. In what sense is that victors writing history, unless you imagine they were somehow forced to do this as part of the peace agreement? So, you know, there is another question of reckoning, and we are a global society. I mean, you can talk about 9/11 as an American event, obviously, but it was impactful around the world, and you know, the world divides, I guess, pro and con on 9/11, not along national lines. And so that's, I think, what the strength of these institutions are. Now, you know, there are people, hijackers as the first of them, who thought that this was a good idea. And so while we present in our museum, you know, the rationale for what they did have a reason for doing it. I guess we reject that rationale, and so in that sense, we're writing history. But in what sense is 9/11 a victory? You know, how can it be defined as a victory? So, I do think, you know, in a global society where people are moving across lines, at least in pre-COVID times, although we're here, so that's good. You know, I think the lines are not quite, they don't follow the national maps of the world anymore.
Well, I will add, well, two things. Yes, of course, history is written by the winners. In my case, I'm a specialist on World War II and especially on the Holocaust. It has been written by the winners with the archives of the losers. So let's see, my usual answer to this kind of vérité, if I can say that. On the question of who won, I don't know. This is one of a question we raised in our discussions inside the team, not outside, because dealing with so many terrorist attacks, not only in France, because it's not focusing in France, it's also focusing on an international situation. This is a question: is a terrorist attack winning, and which one won? And what they won. And I don't know the answer. There's so many different answers. But you say something which, for me, is one of the problems of a project. With building this museum within not a war, I wouldn't say we are in the middle of a war, but terrorism is still there. We are facing, especially in France, like in the US, some real and concrete threats of new attacks. So what is the meaning to build a museum? To build a memorial, no question. People, I mean, societies have built memorials within wars, even at the very beginning of the war. The first memorial of World War I has been built in 1914. Building a museum is another thing. And here there is a political aspect which has been defined by the team itself, not by President Macron. It's not a political will. We did it. And we said to build a museum while we're still under the threat of an attack is a kind of cultural resistance. It's a way to say we are not completely intimidated by terror. And one of the ways to face terrorism is to try to grasp with the phenomenon, to understand it, to provide a meaning, even if we will have bombs.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. So much to think about there, but if there's another question, maybe, yes.
Yeah, I mean, my apologies if this kind of revisits the first question, which was perhaps asked more eloquently than I'm going to do. I mean, I accept that you're not writing the history of the victor, but when you talk about doing a global history and a kind of a plural history, which I admire. I think you may be minimizing the problem. I mean, when I go around these museums, whether it's a Holocaust museum or a terrorism museum, the enemy, they're there, but they're kind of cardboard men. They're not, you don't really hear the voice of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, you don't hear the voice of Khattab, and understandably, because ultimately you kind of have a choice. When you either give these people substantial space to explain their worldview, in which case you're kind of handing the microphone to Voldemort, and that's kind of not a good thing. I mean, you were just saying, this is about demonstrating that we're not cowed by terrorism. You either hand the microphone to Voldemort or you kind of minimize these people. And in all the museums I've been around, even the really excellent ones, the enemy becomes a kind of cardboard man. And surely this is kind of unavoidable unless you want to give the microphone to Osama bin Laden.
Yeah, I have to say, at some point you're making choices, obviously, and we have a bias in what we think of the story, and whether it should have happened. So in that sense, yes. But again, you go to the what's it called in Berlin, the Topography of Terror. I mean, that's the voice of the Gestapo. That. And it's an extraordinarily powerful thing. Again, it's framed in a context of a society that has rejected that and has acknowledged by presenting this material its own failings. I think there are some places, not that many, but some, in the American South that have done that in terms of our history. I think newer ones are coming in place that are taking that on. And representing the voices of the people who suffered, under those conditions. But I think you've put your finger on a difficult problem. I mean, we are educational institutions to be sure, but we are educational institutions in our societies that are, in our case, presenting a story of an attack on our society. And so there will not be a 50-50 balance, almost by definition.
When we did our Enemy Within exhibit, we had a section on the 60s and the Weather Underground, and no one remembers that the U.S. Senate was bombed in 1971. That's not something people remembered. It's something we brought out, but we actually had Bernadine Dorn, who was part of the Weather Underground. We interviewed her. So we're letting her tell why she believed that they were not terrorists, that what they were doing was not terrorists. It's her voice, she's speaking. And we chose to have her talk, to hear that perspective. So we don't do it all the time, but we thought it was important for people to hear at this point with this historic perspective. And, and of course she's not in jail at this point, but we also deal with former spies. Should we be having former spies talk? I mean, it's interesting, but it's if you want people to understand, to a certain degree, you got to have them hear it.
Do you have anything to add on
A
this?
small answer. Yes, of course, what you're saying is quite obvious, but it's not obvious just for a museum. It's obvious for a textbook, for any historical narrative. So, but here again, actually, we have another problem, not to pay too much attention to the words or to the traces of the perpetrators. I mean, usually, I'm talking as a historian of the Holocaust, and I've been working on wars, violence, whatever. When you're dealing with these issues, usually you have much more sources coming from the perpetrator than coming from the victims. So the problem we have is exactly the reverse, because most of our elements are coming from the police, from the perpetrators, from the scene of the crime. So we have to find a balance. But in another way, of course, we are defending values in this museum. Mm-hmm. I would be naive or a hypocrite not to say that. Of course we do.
Can I just add one thing, because it's very much this point, and So I was involved in just speaking with the folks in Norway who did their education centers and memorials for the victims of that July 22nd, 2011 terrorist attack. And I was there for the opening of this education center in Norway, which was 4 years. It was amazing that they put it together so quickly. And at that point, there had been, as I arrived, this extraordinary debate about the fact that the man they referred to as the perpetrator, not using his name, would be in this education center. And the newspapers were echoing the challenge of one family member that this was going to be the Breivik Museum. Yeah? So they opened it and they used, and this is what Henri was referring to what is happening in the trials here, they actually used the court documents as the way of presenting this person with a photograph of him sitting at the trial. Fast forward to this summer, 10 years of the anniversary, I go back. Now they've, because of the reconstruction of the government center, they've actually moved the education center temporarily to a new site, so they had to redo it. But in redoing it, on the entry panel at the museum now is the name of Breivik and reference to him not as the perpetrator, but as a terrorist. And so in that short period of 5 or 6 years, the social acceptance of this has changed to the point where the folks doing the museum could actually reframe how he was presented in the museum.
Next, what?
Thank you. I'm interested in this question in the passage of time, and the personal experience I have of this. There's a Holocaust center and museum in England, which is outside of Nottingham, in the middle of nowhere, and because it's in the middle of nowhere, what it does, it mainly caters for school kids to come, and so there's an educative function to it. But we've had a number of discussions with the educators there, and they're facing the problem is to say that the school kids come, they get told the facts about the Holocaust, and then they leave again. And for them, it's just a kind of a historical artifact, right? And they can't link it to anything today. So they're told, like, look, this is terrible. These things have happened. It's bad, blah, blah. And they're like, okay, that's fine. Those things are bad. But then they go back and there's no link to the present, right? And I think that's an interesting thing. It's obviously 9/11 is it's not really there yet, but there is an interesting question of the passage of time. And what we've been thinking about doing is to try to link that, because I work on conspiracy theories, it's like, okay, well, actually what we're going to do is we're going to try to link anti-Semitism with contemporary conspiracy theories so that we try to say, look, there is a link to today. This is how one of the ways, right? It's one of the ways you can articulate that. And I just wonder, I was just trying to get a sense from you, because Henri said, the truth. It's like, well, I think what the feedback we're getting from the educators is that the truth, just telling the truth in itself is not enough. It's because you tell these people, look, this has happened, it's bad. They're like, okay, yeah, sure, but that's a historical truth, and we can't link it to what it is today. And there's something else that needs to be done. Just telling the truth and just telling the facts is enough, because we also know that if you're a conspiracy theorist, just telling somebody the truth is not going to change their mind. So I just wonder if there's a further, when we get into that terrain where it's further and further from historical. I have no experience of that. 9/11 I know, but I have no experience of that. How do we continue that conversation forward and still make it relevant? And I wonder whether, because you've kind of batted back again, well, obviously people are asking us questions. You didn't ask this question about 9/11, of course, and yes, because they want you to say, well, what really happened is this, and it was the FBI and all of that. Of course, you're right. But at the same time, I wonder how much of engagement that has to be done with those types of claims to be able to make it, still relevant today. So I'd be very interested in your thoughts. Thanks.
That's an excellent question. And just in the interest of time, we have another question over here somewhere. We'll take both and then respond sort of one after the other.
Hello. My name is Nelly Dobrevon, and I'm really impressed to hear absolutely the same discourse during this, let's say, not 20, but maybe 11 or 12 years that I'm on the subject. And I'm still wondering why do you need to put on the template of the Holocaust the way you are creating the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. And don't you think that by doing so, you're still keeping open sources for conspiracy theories? Thank you.
Okay, big questions. So let's start with Hugo's, the one about the passage of time and how that changes the obligation that we have to do something different than just present the facts. Maybe, I don't know which one of you would like to start.
Well, I just want to say, I just go back to finding these underlying timeless issues that you're talking about, making connections to today. You've got to make the connections. There's got to be, for people to learn, there has to be an element of empathy, historical empathy, present. People have to feel something if they're going to think about and make change. Again, I'm an educator, so I look at, what do you want the outcome to be? It's not just to know the facts, but you want them to make behavioral change, attitude change. So how do you do that?
Yeah, we spent a lot of time thinking about conspiracy theories. And I mean, the truthers would come to the early 9/11 commemorations and harass family members. So this is not just an incidental phenomenon. I have to say, my own sense of all of this is their alternate explanations are not the point. The point is always, they know why it happened. It's not the what. What they're really interested in is the why. So you just sort of, whatever they say, sure, say it. It has nothing to do with evidence, it has nothing to do with relevance. What they really want to do is be the ones who uncover the real truth and explain the whys, whether it's the Jews or the CIA or whoever did it. This is what they're trying to prove. So, we live in a world where this has gained all kinds of power that it didn't have before. And what do you return to? I mean, I may have misspoken a little bit before, but, the Holocaust as a template for public memory doesn't just set a specific thing. It just establishes the fact that certain kinds of events have a value to be remembered for the society. So when we go back to this next generation, the starting point is they don't actually know what happened. I mean, it's amazing to be, I started working on this in 2005. Everybody remembered it in 2005. It was unimaginable that we would be in a position where we would have to literally go back to square one and start talking about 4 planes in 102 minutes. And, but that is where you go back to. And what you build into that is a sense of the historical context, what happened afterward. But, we never engage directly with the conspiracy theories. We have recognized them as a phenomenon. But as I said before, I mean, there are conspiracy theories about COVID. It has nothing to do with 9/11. They stem from the same root. The Holocaust denial is not even the first example of historical denial, but again, it shapes so much of what this is. But always it's about the why, not the what.
I would like to answer to your question and the idea that historical experience taught to young people is usually disconnected from their personal experience. I wrote it 20 years ago on a book about the question of the memory, how the growing issue of the memory of the Holocaust and the huge investment in schools, and the disconnection was a major problem. We won't have these problems in our museum for a simple reason. First, terrorism is not the only topic. I didn't mention it because I didn't have time, but we have 3 main topics in the whole project, not just for the permanent exhibit, but for all the la programmation, all the other the temporary exhibition and whatever. So we will speak about the effect of terrorism in contemporary societies, and we are living through. Our everyday life has changed because of terrorism. Our laws have changed because of terrorism. Our way of traveling has completely changed because of terrorism. All these things are concrete current experiences made by anybody. So this is one of the most important things we want to show in this museum. Terrorism is something which concerns everybody today and even tomorrow. So it's not just, I say it's a museum in history. In the official classification, it's in French. In France, it's a museum in history and society. So, I mean, we don't just speak about history, something which is happening, which is cold. We're talking about something which is going on. One more time, an anecdote. When I presented this project to the new Garde des Sceaux, the Ministry of Justice, I mean, when we arrive at power, I had to present the project a little bit. And he said, this place will be a target. Mm-hmm. So we are a target, of course. So we are in the core of dealing with the present, not just with history.
And then finally, did you have any response to the other question about the Holocaust as a template and any problems that might be generating in the realm of public memory?
Yes, of course. I mean, well, I wrote it in several books. So the memory of the Holocaust became a model for many other things. So, for example, and I go back to another question. Yes, we are working, for example, with the Mémorial de la Shoah in Paris. What we're trying to do is to go further. For example, one more time, terrorism is not the only purpose of the museum. This museum, if I had to present it in a very, very general way, my ambition, it's not completely immodest, it's completely immodest, is to build a huge museum about contemporary history in Paris today. So through the question of terrorism, we want to reach many, many, many other questions. And this is exactly what the Mémorial de la Shoah and many other Holocaust museums all over the world have done. Mm-hmm. I don't know for the British one, but I'm sure for the French one. For example, today, if you go to the Mémorial de la Shoah, they are dealing with the Holocaust, they're dealing with the genocide of the Tutsis, and then they're dealing with the Armenian genocide. We are exactly in the same perspective, but now we benefit from their experience, and we will build a museum dedicated to contemporary history as a whole from the very beginning.
Well, thank you all so much, and thank you to our organizers for this wonderful opportunity to be together and to talk about these very sensitive and fascinating issues. And it has been a pleasure, and thank you all very, very much. And thank you to our amazing panelists for joining us today as well.
Thank you.
Just one last word. Thank you so much for this amazing panel, very deep and educational. Thank you so much, Jim McAuley. And well, maybe I switch to the French because there are still many French-speaking people in the room. Donc, merci beaucoup à vous tous. Je remercie vraiment particulièrement les orateurs de cette dernière table ronde, qui était extrêmement saisissante, et comme d'ailleurs la table ronde d'hier, puisque on a commencé ce colloque en parlant de l'emprise du 11 septembre sur nous, du choc, etc. Et là, on est vraiment maintenant aussi dans le travail d'éducation qui est opéré par ces musées, qui est opéré, on l'a vu hier, par les séries télévisées, qui sont un autre sujet aussi. Et je crois que, en effet, même si c'est pas forcément approprié, il y a quelque chose de très positif, comme Anna le souhaitait, quelque chose de très encourageant, et en particulier pour tous les jeunes chercheurs. Donc je voulais vraiment remercier nos invités à des tables rondes, et puis bien sûr remercier tous les contributeurs, tous ceux qui ont et celles qui ont participé à ce colloque, qui ont fait des interventions absolument remarquables, parfois dans des conditions pas faciles. Donc je voudrais vraiment me réjouir de ce qui s'est passé pendant ces 2 jours, et qui vraiment nous montre à quel point donc la recherche et la jeune recherche, on vient d'en parler, est précieuse pour continuer à avancer sur ces sujets et toujours aussi avec vraiment des enjeux pas seulement sociaux et politiques, mais moraux, éthiques qui sont apparus là, qui sont absolument essentiels. Donc, et je remercie bien sûr toute l'équipe de DEMOSERIES. J'ai déjà remercié Partie, l'IRSEM, les institutions. Je voudrais dire à quel point je suis reconnaissante à toute l'équipe, bien sûr, à Pauline d'abord, Anastasia, donc Sylvie, Thibaut, Théo. Maintenant, je pense que vous les connaissez bien comme des personnages bien connus. Et vraiment merci à eux.
I just wanted to say really thank you to all our American guests, because it's been a real pleasure to have you, and I think it was absolutely impossible to do such a conference without having you. So I want to thank you for, traveling under difficult circumstances, and I hope this is the beginning of a very fruitful and hopefully ongoing conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pardon, j'ai oublié l'essentiel. Donc maintenant, on va pouvoir boire un verre. Voilà, cocktail. Vous êtes tous invités, évidemment. Ça sera bien mérité après ces 2 jours.